Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During the annual debate, and I yield myself as much time as I may.
The gentleman is recognized for as much time as he may consume.
Mr. Speaker, during the annual debate on the budget resolution, the House assigns 1 hour to the Joint Economic Committee to assess current economic conditions and evaluate how the budget resolution, if implemented, would improve the outlook for America's economy. As chairman of the Joint Economic Committee during the 113th session of Congress, I'm pleased to lead this discussion. For more than 2 years, the Joint Economic Committee has demonstrated that the current recovery we're in is the weakest of all recoveries, lasting at least a year since World War II, in terms of economic growth, in terms of jobs, and of personal income for families. Let's examine the following 3 charts. In each, the red line depicts the current recovery, where we're headed right now. The navy blue lines depict the average of all the other recoveries since World War II, and the navy blue lines depict the average of these recoveries. Since the recession ended 3.5 years ago, our real economy, the real GDP, has grown by a mere 7.5%. That's this line. But during the comparable period, real economic growth averaged more than double than that, 17.5% in other post-war recoveries. It is a huge gap between where we are today as a nation and just the average C student, middle-of-the-road recovery of the past. We are lagging far behind. There is a serious growth gap. President Obama often boasts that his recovery has generated 6.4 million jobs in the private sector since we hit a low in February 2010. But if you look at previous post-war recoveries, just apples to apples, however, the average increase in private jobs over the comparable time would have generated an equivalent of 10.4 million jobs. This is the comparison. These are the jobs of the current recovery. This is just the average. And that blue shaded area is the range between the very worst, the one we're in, and the very best, which is a lot more jobs. In fact, today, this recovery, compared to the average, we're missing 4 million jobs in America. We're missing more than $1 trillion out of our economy because of the current recovery and this growth gap. In fact, if this recovery had been merely average, middle of the road, instead of having fewer jobs along Main Street than when the recession began, which is where we're at right now, fewer jobs along Main Street, private payroll employment would have been at an all-time high if this would have just been an average recovery. Sluggish economic growth and job creation have also slowed personal income growth, the money that you earn as a family. In recovery since 1960, disposable income, real disposable income, apples to apples per person, grew by $3,500 over 43 months. But during the same period, this is where the average income for families have grown. But look where we are under the current recovery. During the same period, for the current recovery, personal income growth for a family, it isn't $3,500. It's about $416. So this current recovery is taking a real toll on families. It's taking a real toll on our economy and on jobs. And I think what's more worrisome than this economy's weak performance is the ability of our economy to grow and create private sector jobs in the future. And economic evidence shows that it may have permanently fallen. In the most recent Budget and Economic Outlook, Congressional Budget Office lowered its estimate for our long-term growth as a nation, the potential GDP, from its average since 1950 of 3.3%, they lowered it in our future to 2.3%. Now, 1 percentage point may not sound like much, but it has a huge effect on our economy, on our jobs, and on the ability of the federal government to pay its bills. Think about it like this. At America's traditional 3.3% growth rate of the past half a century, our real economy doubles every 22 years. But at this new normal, this new slower rate of 2.3%, It takes almost 32 years to double in size. That's a decade longer. That's a decade slower. A permanent growth gap of 1% translates into 1/3 slower growth for our young people seeking to find their first job, and for families hoping to reach their American dream. A permanent growth gap of 1% means our economy will be $20 trillion smaller in 2052. That's actually a growth gap for 1 year larger than the entire American economy today. It also means it'll be harder to balance the federal budget, since a permanent growth gap of 1% means the loss of a whopping $93 trillion from our federal coffers again over the next 4 decades. Think about $93 trillion today. The unfunded liability for Social Security, Medicare, and our federal pensions in today's dollars is only $87 billion. So the prospect of a new normal for America's economy in which our future growth permanently slows by 1/3 should be a red flag for all Americans. We are told in school growing up that in Shakespeare's play, a soothsayer told Julius Caesar, "Beware the Ides of March, the 15th." Ironically, this year President Obama released his economic report of the president on that ominous date. And buried in this report are some startling admissions and some dire warnings for the American people. And unlike Caesar, this Congress should take heed. First, the President's report acknowledged the current recovery is indeed the weakest since World War II, as Republicans on the Joint Economic Committee have been saying now for more than 2 years. This growth gap, it's real, and it's widening. Second, our economy's ability to grow in the future, the growth rate of potential GDP has decreased. The President admits that. Unfortunately, President Obama then seeks to blame this new normal on everything other than his economic leadership. The report attributes 2/3 of the decrease to demographic factors, specifically an aging population and a slower rate of net immigration. The report attributes the remaining 1/3 to just about everything that's ever occurred in the last 5 years. You know, demographic factors account for some of the new normal, but if you think about it, our potential economy for the future, it's a function of how many hours that are worked in America and the growth of the workers, how productive they are. And in turn, what drives that productivity of the American worker is that businesses invest in new business, new equipment, new buildings, new software. That drives jobs along Main Street. And it's really the policies of the Obama White House, higher taxes, the unwillingness to propose real solutions to save Social Security and Medicare for future generations, the prospect of higher costs and regulations due to the President's new Obamacare law, how we regulate our local banks, and global warming regulations, and the suppression of energy production on federal lands and waters. America's lands and waters have generated so much uncertainty, and it's really squelched new business investment in America. And unlike real personal consumption, non-residential investment from the business community still remains below what it was before the recession began. Mr. Speaker, this new normal for America, the growth gap we're in today, the prospect that America will grow slower in the future is unacceptable. Republican members of this House are working to accelerate growth. And a big step we can take forward tonight is to pass the House budget. It is a responsible, balanced budget. By estimations, it will raise our economic growth by 1% in the next year. That's significant. And add $1,500 in new purchasing power for households. And if you look over the long term, over the next 10 years, the House budget could well add up to 3% to our economic growth and $4,000 per household in real income people don't have today, real gains that they don't have today. Truth of the matter is, the roadblocks to America's future are still in place. The prospect of higher taxes, the failure to reform and save our entitlements, Obamacare with all the new taxes, new regulations, and higher costs for families, and the fact that we are not pursuing tax reform, at least from this White House, but the Ways and Means Committee and House Republicans in this budget move toward a fairer, simpler tax code that closes tax loopholes and does it not to fuel spending, but rather to fuel lower rates for families and small businesses and make us competitive again as a nation. This budget resolution, this responsible, balanced budget, developed by the Budget Committee chaired by Paul Ryan, is a first step toward a brighter economic future for our children and grandchildren. I reserve the balance of my time, Speaker.
The gentleman from Texas reserves his time. The gentlelady from